What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we have explained classic Loki, we've explained Lady Loki, and so in this video we're going to explain Kid Loki. Now, Kid Loki is a really cool concept, and it's kind of a benefit, or sort of in addition to this, we'll actually sort of bookend into the origin of Ikol, which is basically Loki spelled backwards, just because the origin of these characters sort of go hand in hand. But for those of you guys who have been a part of my channel for a long time, we're going to kick things off by talking about Siege on Asgard, so that's not going to be new to you, especially if you've read the comic or you've seen my videos on Siege on Asgard. But the important thing here is that Loki, in the events of Siege on Asgard, had already returned as Lady Loki. Basically, when Ragnarok happened and Asgard was destroyed, Loki's soul took over the body that was meant for Sif, and so Loki came back as a chick, basically. Had some cool stories, it was pretty interesting, but Loki's overall philosophy was that the Asgardians didn't have any business residing on Earth for a couple different reasons. One, because he saw that in the cosmic order of beings as they exist throughout the whole universe, that Asgardians were beyond humanity, right? That there was no reason for humanity to associate with the Asgardians on that level. And so just by that kind of metaphorical belief system, Loki wanted Asgard, the actual castle, land, whatever you want to call it, to return to its home dimension, which is also called Asgard, and to sort of operate from there. The other part of that is that Loki believed because Asgardians were beyond humans, physically they don't need to be in the same place, right? And so what he sought to do was basically orchestrate a series of circumstances where the Asgardians would come to the realization that Earth didn't want them. And so Loki allied himself with Norman Osborn, who at that point had taken over as director of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then you got the Siege on Asgard event. The biggest issue that happened with that is Loki's plan backfired completely. Instead, what ended up happening is the Void, who's kind of like this evil alternate persona of the superhero of the Century, ended up taking over the Century's body and then killed Loki in the process and trashed all of Asgard. And so when that happened, Loki effectively died. Now from there, of course, you go into the conclusion of Siege on Asgard, the Void's defeated and all that kind of stuff and so on and so forth. But one of the big takeaways from this is you go into really Thor by Matt Fraction, which kind of kicks off with issue 617 going forward. And what you end up finding out is that classic Loki knew that he was eventually going to die for real. Specifically, there was a strong possibility with the plan he was going for to get Asgard back to its home dimension. And so in order to ensure that if he did die, that he would be able to come back, he ended up sort of making a deal with Hela, who you guys know basically runs the realm of Hell, kind of the afterlife for Asgardians, or at least those who don't die in honorable battle. Those guys actually go to Valhalla. But for the average Asgardian, somebody like Loki, who's really spent most of his existence being a dick, he was going to go to the realm of Hell. In order to ensure that didn't happen, what Loki did is he made a deal to have his name removed from the books of Hela. Now, the books of Hela are kind of is basically like this ledger that keeps track of all the people who are essentially going to die, and that when their time comes, if they don't go to Valhalla, they go to her realm. Loki having his name removed from that kind of granted him a sort of temporary immortality. And I say temporary because in Marvel Comics, immortality is kind of a wonky thing. Let's talk about this for a second. A lot of people confuse immortality in Marvel Comics with invulnerability in Marvel Comics. Immortality and invulnerability are not mutually exclusive. They're not the same thing. The reality here is a person who is genuinely immortal is basically a being who will never die of old age and they'll never die of disease. They can be killed in other ways, right? You can cut the head off a person who's immortal and then separate their head from their body, and as long as they stay separated, that person will die. There's only a couple exceptions to that. Deadpool, when he was cursed with immortality by Thanos, Deadpool, basically his healing factor is what kept him immortal in that capacity during the Funeral for a Freak storyline when Deadpool grew back from a hand, different things like that. Thanos is actually banned from the realm of Mistress Death, so he can never really die. He'll just stay alive forever and ever and ever. Even when he died during the events of like Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, in the Secret Wars event, that Thanos actually ended up in the realm of what was called Oblivion. He was basically outside the multiverse in a realm of nothingness because he was immortal. There was nowhere for him to go. So he just kind of ended up there. Invulnerability means you cannot be defeated or you cannot be physically harmed so long as the power of the person you're fighting does not supersede your level of invulnerability. So somebody like Loki could be killed easily by somebody like Thanos because Loki is invulnerable, but he's not invulnerable relative to Thanos. He's invulnerable relative to like Iron Man or somebody like that, right? Somebody relatively weak. So again, there's huge differences there, but immortality is a little bit of a wonky thing. In this instance, Loki had it in a temporary capacity. His name was removed from the books once, but it can never stay that way, right? Like if an event comes along where he will die, his name will be put back in the books again, and then he'll go to the realm of Hela, and he'll remain there presumably until the end of the universe and everything is reborn again. But the important thing about this is because his name was removed when he died during the events of Siege on Asgard, during Thor issue number 617, he was reborn in Paris. The kicker to this is he was reborn with a clean slate. He had no idea about his own past, and he didn't have any of his magical energy. Instead, it was just Loki, reborn in human form. Now, Thor eventually figured out what was going on. He basically located Loki and then brought him back to Asgard. Now, by that point in time, Odin was already back, and a lot of the stories, when you looked at like Thor 617 running all the way up to 619 under Matt Fraction, a lot of what was going on with Loki was largely background stuff. And the biggest issue that you had going on with his character was just kind of this desire to show everybody that he wasn't the same villain that he used to be, right? He wasn't the same, the kind of mischievous guy who would do some terrible things that would kind of, cause problems and havoc, or that he would initiate Asgard, because that was kind of the big thing that was being held over his head during those stories was you're the Loki that initiated Asgard. You're the Loki that basically got all of us killed, right? Like that was the big depiction that was shown with his character. And so he was constantly wrestling against that. It was cool because it was interesting to see how a reborn version of Loki, who's basically an innocent kid that doesn't know anything about his past, being told you're the reason why we're all dead, and having that responsibility held against him. And it wasn't just the Asgardians who were doing it, it was Odin as well. Odin didn't like him. He did not like Loki at all. You did see a few moments when Odin basically said, okay, I still see him as my son, even if I don't like him, and I would never actually allow any harm to come to him. But in a lot of ways, it was only ever really Thor who was looking out for him, and Thor who was vouching for him and trying to get Asgardians to trust him. Now, following that, what you ended up getting was Kid Loki kind of going off into his own individual story. But the launch of his individual story actually came with Journey into Mystery, and it was one that really focused on the origin or the creation of the character of Ikol. And so the way this played out is you ended up having Kid Loki, who was sort of lured to this kind of cave, right? This kind of location where he ended up meeting this sort of spiritual specter of his former self. And what he ended up telling him was that somewhere along the line, Loki, at least classic Loki, will return, right? Classic Loki is going to have to find a way to come back because there's going to be all kinds of terrors and threats that are going to face off against Asgard and going to challenge everything that Asgard stands for, and that he's going to need, the power that classic Loki has. Now, of course, we ended up discovering that what classic Loki was referring to, this kind of chaotic craziness and trials and tribulations that were going to go on in Asgard, was largely the events of fear itself. But this basically led to Kid Loki kind of assisting the return of classic Loki, but only insofar that he was sort of transformed into a somewhat younger and teenage version of himself that was called Ikol. Now, the launch of Journey into Mystery featuring Ikol and Kid Loki was pretty significant for a couple different reasons, because a lot of the Matt Fraction work on Kid Loki, again, was focused on this kind of redemption, right? Kid Loki always trying to show the Asgardians that he was a good guy. And this happened in multiple ways. When Kid Loki had helped them defeat Galactus by hiding the World Sea, different things along those lines, but probably his greatest achievement in terms of demonstrating the fact that he was really on the side of the Asgardians came during Fear itself. Now understand, Fear itself dealt a lot with a being called the Serpent, who was basically the secret brother of Odin that nobody ever really knew about, and that he was supposedly supposed to be the rightful heir to Asgard, and Odin had actually stolen that from him. And so when he arose, a few things happened, right? You saw him creating all these different hammers that were kind of like these variants of Mjolnir, and then they were given to these wildly powerful people. So for example, Juggernaut received a hammer and then went forward as an agent of the Serpent. Eventually the Serpent himself rose to power. Now for Kid Loki and Ikol, the cool thing about this is a lot of their actions were a background plot that came to fruition in the conclusion and actually helped to save the day. And what you ended up learning was a few different things. That the overall gist of what it was that Kid Loki had done was to work alongside Mephisto and Hela to basically have them team up, defend their realms, and then basically capture or at least attain something called the Hell Wolf, which would allow him to ride into Limbo and then meet with Surtur, where Surtur had essentially been since the events of the 1990s, and really even during Ragnarok, when he had essentially been defeated at the end of all things. And so the deal that was made by Loki and Ikol was that Surtur, if he would give them a piece of his Twilight Sword, which is basically this gigantic sword that has a myriad of different powers, that if he would give them a piece of it, they would in turn let him destroy Asgard. And so when the Serpent rose to power, the Serpent created what was called Dark Asgard, which was kind of like a dark and twisted version of Asgard as it existed. The intention to build his own army and then invade Asgard proper, destroy it, and then rule it himself, right? To kill off Odin and all those guys. With Ikol and Kid Loki working together, they used their fraction of the Twilight Sword to kind of rewrite the history of the Serpent to basically make it easier for Thor to defeat him, which of course cost the life of Thor. And the pact that was agreed upon between Ikol and Kid Loki basically allowed Surtur to enter into the mortal realm and wipe out Asgard. The difference was he was wiping out Dark Asgard, right? So kind of cleaning up everything that had to do with the Serpent, and Asgard itself continued on. But that right there had solidified everything that had gone on with Kid Loki, insofar as he had basically helped the Asgardians defeat Surtur, he had saved the universe from destruction. The whole kind of redemption arc had largely come to fruition fruition in the sense that Kid Loki had finally demonstrated to the Asgardians and finally won their approval in showing, hey, I'm not the version of Loki that I used to be. The funny thing about this, and this is probably one of the most genius bits of writing to happen in the Loki series for a long time, is you ended up learning that there were a few things going on with Ikol that you didn't realize were actually happening at the time. The first of these is that Ikol was just a concept in the head of Kid Loki. The second thing is that Ikol had actually been working against Kid Loki the entire time. What you got was that following the events of Fear itself, you went into a storyline called the Terrorism Myth, and this had huge changes for the character of Kid Loki, so much so that there was actually a huge amount of fan backlash to it. There wasn't really hatred, it was just people had become attached to Kid Loki. Now, in all honesty, I thought it was beautifully handled, and I thought it was beautifully written, but the overall gist of this is that following Fear itself, you ended up learning that the fear people experience, right? Superheroes, supervillains, regular humans, the fear that people experience at the hands of the serpent had basically continued on, that it had persisted in their minds in the form of what were called fear clots, right? Just these small little nuggets of the potential fear that the serpent might return, or just kind of holdovers from everything that had happened. These kind of fear clots among humanity were basically seized upon by a villain known as Nightmare. Now, a lot of you guys have probably heard of Nightmare, if only in passing, but the long and short of him is he basically feeds on people's fears, specifically their nightmares, as a way to kind of bolster himself. There have also been stories where he's put the whole world to sleep and then fed on the dream energy from sleeping people, and then bolstered his powers to insane levels of capabilities. But the important thing here is that that Nightmare had basically led to the deaths of multiple people by feeding on their energy. And so in order to save the lives of innocent people, that what Kid Loki had done is he had taken the fear of himself, at least the fear of the serpent, all of his insecurities, all those things, and condensed them down into a little source of energy that Nightmare could use. And this was all kind of coming into fruition of something called the Fear Crown. And the idea was that Nightmare could utilize the Fear Crown to amplify his power, and then in turn conquer all the different fear dimensions, all the other fear lords, and then eventually Earth itself. Now, during this time, what you had was a character who was a holdover from Fear itself, who was named Leah. And Leah was initially presented during Fear itself and in the aftermath during the Terrorism Myth as a kind of aid to Loki. I wouldn't really call her like a sidekick so much as like a partner in a lot of ways, and in some circumstances she was almost kind of like the moral voice of Kid Loki. But regardless, the two of them had basically worked together and then informed the other fear lords of what it is that Nightmare was doing, which basically led to the fear lords and Nightmare engaging in this kind of cyclical conflict over trying to attain the Fear Crown, which kind of removed them from the picture for the time being. What you ended up getting in the aftermath of this was the attempt by the demon Mephisto to successfully grab the Fear Crown after defeating all the other fear lords, and then in turn using it as a means to basically unleash hell on Earth. And this is where things changed for Kid Loki completely. And the reason for that is up to that point, it seemed like Ikol, even if he was only just kind of a potential future version of himself, or seemingly the older version of Loki who had returned in his physical form, that instead Ikol was basically just a manifestation of Loki in his own mind, or at least Kid Loki in his own mind, that he wasn't actually real. But the overall gist of this is that Ikol represented classic Loki and that personality, and the desire of Ikol was to bring classic Loki back, but he couldn't do it through conventional means. The only way to do that was to basically have Kid Loki become classic Loki, but that wasn't something Kid Loki was ready to do, because his entire story up to that point was a redemption arc. He was looking to become a good guy, as opposed to being viewed as a kind of villainous character that his former self had been. And so Ikol had orchestrated and manipulated all these different events, ranging from the idea of building on Fear itself for the purpose of getting Kid Loki to build the Fear Crown, and then giving it to Nightmare, knowing that it would be handed over to Mephisto, and then knowing that it would eventually put Kid Loki in this position where the only way to ensure Mephisto could not seize control of all the hell dimensions, and by extension everything else across the universe, to basically conquer all of reality, was to destroy the Fear Crown. But because the Fear Crown was really tethered to the mind of Kid Loki, the only way to do that was to eliminate his existing mind. And the only way to eliminate his existing mind was to rewrite it, so he basically became his former self all over again, albeit in a kid's body. And there was a huge amount of disdain from Kid Loki for this perspective, because in his mind he demonstrated the ability to change, that he had become better, but he had to make a choice. Was he going to basically let the universe be conquered by Mephisto to maintain his current situation, or his current personality, where he was young, he changed, he'd basically been redeemed, he was a good guy now, or would he sacrifice all of that and destroy Mephisto? And he chose the latter. He basically allowed his mind to kind of be rewritten so his former self could come back in a younger body, and then in turn Mephisto was ultimately defeated. But following this, Kid Loki largely ended up becoming classic Loki, not in the perfect sense. It wasn't one of these things where it was like, he's going around and engaging in all these schemes and so on and so forth. Instead, it was a multi-pronged approach. And so by the time you got into 2013, what you actually saw Marvel doing was launching something called Marvel Now. This was Marvel's answer, albeit a poorly planned answer, to DC's New 52. And so Marvel Now was kind of billed as like a new jumping on point. It wasn't. I would never advise anybody to start with Marvel Now, largely because it starts in the middle of nowhere. And so what this did is it kind of reshuffled things, and it actually saw Kid Loki being thrown onto the Young Avengers team. Now, this was cool because the Young Avengers at the time had a really interesting roster. The biggest issue that you had here by the time you got to 2013, and we've talked about this a lot of times before, is that Marvel was winding down, right? They were getting ready for Secret Wars in 2015. And so a lot of these stories that would have normally seen huge expansions and a lot of growth instead were in a lot of ways stopgap stories. So for example, during Young Avengers, the character of Wiccan, who is destined to be the Demiurge, right? This being that could consume and destroy all gods and possibly even all of reality itself. It led to a few stories with Loki involving him, and it led to Loki involving the mother, and then it led to all these weird set of events and so on and so forth. But the overall gist of this is that it focused almost exclusively on Loki's feelings of guilt, right? The things that he'd done, allowing himself to become his former version, right? Allowing classic Loki's personality to more or less replace his kind of redemption arc, and then in turn going forward from there. And so you learned that like Leah had reappeared, but that was just a manifestation of his guilt, that he had basically left the Young Avengers because he didn't believe that he was worthy of any of their forgiveness for the things that he had done. It was a lot of just self-deprecation that were going on in his stories, which it wasn't designed to be like a bad thing. It wasn't designed to be one of these, oh, woe is me, the world, I'm so misunderstood by the world. It wasn't really designed to be like that. It was designed to kind of continue on focusing on the personality of Kid Loki, and in a lot of ways, the story's kind of being background, which was cool. It was a totally different take on the character of Loki from what we'd ever seen before, and it was great. So the big kicker about this is that once you get to Agent of Asgard, that's really the story that a lot of people reference as being one of the best Loki runs in the history of Marvel Comics, and I agree, right? Because this introduced future King Loki, which was kind of like this really twisted, evil version of the character that Kid Loki could become, right? That he would potentially turn into. And that version of Loki had done things like destroy all life on Earth. He had become like Loki the All Butcher when he took the sword of Gore the God Butcher, following Gore's death, and then eventually Gore returned. You saw some really cool things going on there, right? Some really awesome concepts taking place. But one of the other cool things that you saw was that he had actually befriended a woman by the name of Verity Willis. Now, Verity Willis was cool because she was a girl that always knew when she was being lied to, but again, stuff was winding down pretty fast. And so what you ended up finding was a few confrontations with King Loki. A lot of the really cool King Loki stuff actually came at the end of Agent of Asgard, by the time you got around to issues 14, 15, different things like that. But you also kind of got this sort of, this kind of indication that Kid Loki knew a lot more than he was initially letting on, right? Like when the multiverse collapsed and the ones who sat above in shadow had returned, there was a lot of indication that maybe they were the Beyonders. But again, it was kind of all over the place, right? It was sort of everywhere, because in a lot of ways it was like, let's just kind of wrap these plot threads up, let's get into Secret Wars, and let's just kind of go from there. And so what you really got here as far as Kid Loki was concerned was just the last days, right? Just the last days of all things. Then you go into the post-Secret Wars landscape, you basically transitioned over to Ikol. And that's where a bit of the murkiness comes into play, because it's one of these things where depending on what comic book fan you're talking to, me for example, I consider the whole Asgardians of the Galaxy storyline to be the storyline where Kid Loki stopped being Kid Loki and basically became Ikol. Some people say that it hasn't really even happened yet, right? That it's one of these things where it's still basically Kid Loki, just operating under a different name or by a different set of beliefs or whatever the case happens to be. At this moment right now, Kid Loki in the traditional sense is not really part of this anymore. Instead, it's just Ikol who's kind of out there, and there's this like King Loki in the future who's his potential future self. There's no guarantee that'll actually come to fruition, but a lot of it just kind of focuses on him. So what we'll do is we'll make a video on Ikol if you guys are interested in seeing that, and then we'll basically explore pretty much the concept of Loki in the aftermath of Secret Wars from 2015 and how his character's kind of progressed and grown and gone from there. But with that being said, guys, thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.